Chapter 18 of the Elusive Pimpernel, by Baroness Orsi, read for LibriVox.org by Karen Savage, in February 2008. Chapter 18. Number 6. Consciousness returned very slowly, very painfully. It was night when last Marguerite had clearly known what was going on around her. It was daylight before she realised that she still lived, that she still knew and suffered. Her head ached intolerably. That was the first conscious sensation which came to her. Then she vaguely perceived a pale ray of sunshine, very hazy and narrow, which came from somewhere in front of her and struck her in the face. She kept her eyes tightly shut, for that filmy light caused her an increase of pain. She seemed to be lying on her back, and her fingers, wandering restlessly around, felt a hard palliasse beneath their touch, then a rough pillow, and her own cloak laid over her. Thought had not yet returned, only the sensation of great suffering and of infinite fatigue. Anon she ventured to open her eyes, and gradually one or two objects detached themselves from out the haze which still obscured her vision. Firstly, the narrow aperture, scarcely a window, filled in with tiny squares of coarse, unwashed glass, through which the rays of the morning sun were making kindly efforts to penetrate. Then the cloud of dust illumined by those same rays, and made up, so it seemed to the poor tired brain that strove to perceive, of myriads of abnormally large molecules, overabundant and overactive, for they appeared to be dancing a kind of wild saraband before Marguerite's aching eyes, advancing and retreating, forming themselves into groups and taking on funny shapes of weird masks and grotesque faces, which grinned at the unconscious figure lying helpless on the rough palliasse. Through and beyond them, Marguerite gradually became aware of 3 walls of a narrow room, dank and grey, half covered with whitewash and half with greenish mildew. Yes, and there, opposite to her and immediately beneath that semblance of a window, was another palliasse, and on it something dark that moved. The words "Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité ou la Mort" stared out at her from somewhere beyond those active molecules of dust. But she also saw, just above the other palliasse, the vague outline of a dark crucifix. It seemed a terrible effort to coordinate all these things, and to try and realize what the room was, and what was the meaning of the palliasse, the narrow window and the stained walls, too much altogether for the aching head to take in save very slowly, very gradually. Marguerite was content to wait and to let memory creep back as reluctantly as it would. "Do you think, my child, you could drink a little of this now?" It was a gentle, rather tremulous voice which struck upon her ear. She opened her eyes, and noticed that the dark something which had previously been on the opposite palliasse was no longer there, and that there appeared to be a presence close to her only vaguely defined, someone kindly and tender who had spoken to her in French, with that soft sing-song accent peculiar to the Normandy peasants, and who now seemed to be pressing something cool and soothing to her lips. "They gave me this for you," continued the tremulous voice close to her ear. "I think it would do you good, if you tried to take it." A hand and arm was thrust underneath the rough pillow, causing her to raise her head a little. A glass was held to her lips, and she drank. The hand that held the glass was all wrinkled, brown and dry, and trembled slightly, but the arm which supported her head was firm and very kind. "There, I am sure you feel better now. Close your eyes and try to go to sleep." She did as she was bid, and was ready enough to close her eyes. It seemed to her presently as if something had been interposed between her aching head and that trying ray of white September sun. Perhaps she slept peacefully for a little while after that, for though her head was still very painful, her mouth and throat felt less parched and dry. Through this sleep, or semblance of sleep, she was conscious of the same pleasant voice, softly droning paters and aves close to her ear. Thus she lay during the greater part of the day, not quite fully conscious, not quite awake to the awful memories which anon would crowd upon her thick and fast. From time to time, the same kind and trembling hands would, with gentle pressure, force a little liquid food through her unwilling lips. Some warm soup, or anon a glass of milk. Beyond the pain in her head, she was conscious of no physical ill. She felt at perfect peace, and an extraordinary sense of quiet and repose seemed to pervade this small room, with its narrow window through which the rays of the sun came gradually in more golden splendour as the day drew towards noon, and then they vanished altogether. The drony voice close beside her acted as a soporific upon her nerves. In the afternoon she fell into a real and beneficent sleep. But after that she woke to full consciousness. Oh, the horror, the folly of it all! It came back to her with all the inexorable force of an appalling certainty. She was a prisoner in the hands of those who long ago had sworn to bring the Scarlet Pimpernel to death. She, his wife, a hostage in their hands, her freedom and safety offered to him as the price of his own. Here there was no question of dreams or of nightmares, no illusions as to the ultimate intentions of her husband's enemies. It was all a reality, and even now, before she had the strength fully to grasp the whole nature of this horrible situation, she knew that by her own act of mad and passionate impulse she had hopelessly jeopardized the life of the man she loved. For with that sublime confidence in him begotten of her love, she never for a moment doubted which of the two alternatives he would choose when once they were placed before him. He would sacrifice himself for her. He would prefer to die 1,000 deaths, so long as they set her free. For herself, her own sufferings, her danger or humiliation, she cared nothing. Nay, at this very moment she was conscious of a wild, passionate desire for death. In this sudden onrush of memory and of thought, she wished with all her soul and heart and mind to die here suddenly, on this hard paillasse, in this lonely and dark prison, so that she should be out of the way once and for all, so that she should not be the hostage to be bartered against his precious life and freedom. He would suffer acutely, terribly at her loss, because he loved her above everything else on earth. He would suffer in every fibre of his passionate and ardent nature, but he would not then have to endure the humiliations, the awful alternatives, the galling impotence and miserable death, the relentless either-or which his enemies were even now preparing for him. And then came a revulsion of feeling. Marguerite's was essentially a buoyant and active nature, a keen brain which worked and schemed and planned, rather than one ready to accept the inevitable. Hardly had these thoughts of despair and of death formulated themselves in her mind, than with brilliant swiftness a new train of ideas began to take root. What if matters were not so hopeless after all? Already her mind had flown instinctively to thoughts of escape. Had she the right to despair? She, the wife and intimate companion of the man who had astonished the world with his daring, his prowess, his amazing good luck, she to imagine for a moment that in this all-supreme moment of adventurous life the Scarlet Pimpernel would fail? Was not English society peopled with men, women and children, whom his ingenuity had rescued from plights quite as seemingly hopeless as her own? And would not all the resources of that inventive brain be brought to bear upon this rescue, which touched him nearer and more deeply than any which he had attempted hitherto? Now Marguerite was chiding herself for her doubts and for her fears. Already she remembered that amongst the crowd on the landing stage she had perceived a figure, unusually tall, following in the wake of Chauvelin and his companions. Awakened hope had already assured her that she had not been mistaken, that Percy, contrary to her own surmises, had reached Boulogne last night. He always acted so differently to what anyone might expect, that it was quite possible that he had crossed over in the packet boat after all, unbeknown to Marguerite as well as to his enemies. Oh yes! The more she thought about it all, the more sure she was that Percy was already in Boulogne, and that he knew of her capture and her danger. What right had she to doubt even for a moment that he would know how to reach her, how, when the time came, to save himself and her? A warm glow began to fill her veins, she felt excited and alert, absolutely unconscious now of pain or fatigue in this radiant joy of reawakened hope. She raised herself slightly, leaning on her elbow. She was still very weak, and the slight movement had made her giddy, but soon she would be strong and well. She must be strong and well, and ready to do his bidding when the time for escape would have come. "Ah! you are better, my child, I see," said that quaint, tremulous voice again, with its soft, sing-song accent. "But you must not be so venturesome, you know. The physician said that you had received a cruel blow. The brain has been rudely shaken, and you must lie quite still all to-day, or your poor little head will begin to ache again." Marguerite turned to look at the speaker, and in spite of her excitement, of her sorrow and of her anxieties, she could not help smiling at the whimsical little figure which sat opposite to her, on a very rickety chair, solemnly striving with slow and measured movement of hand and arm, and a large supply of breath,